This is
Make it plain.
Make it plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make it plain.
Get woke.
Ladies and gentlemen, in light of the most recent election here in the United States and the fact that so many people voted to re-elect Donald Trump, someone who is without a doubt a racist and a xenophobe and a homophobe, it raises some serious concerns about what has happened to America, in America, since the presidency, the seemingly transformative presidency of Barack Obama. So we thought we'd do well to speak with an author who's written a book about how he himself has tried to find his blackness in a white world. The author of the book is Cole Brown, and the title of the book is Greyboy. Cole Brown joins us on Make It Plain from Sydney, Australia. Cole, how are you, my brother?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. What are you doing? What in the world are you doing in Sydney?
I moved here in February, which, as we now know, was not excellent timing to move across the world. Came here for a job, almost immediately went into lockdown, but now I'm a full-time writer, so I write here in Sydney, both for local news outlets, and then I cover the U.S. politics for some of the national broadcasts as well.
So I guess the timing was bad in terms of the pandemic. How are things in Sydney in terms of COVID and the pandemic?
Our COVID experience speaks to the importance of good governance in a way. They took it really seriously here. So our lockdown was significant in those early months, what would have been the spring and early summer for the U.S. But we came out of it, and now COVID is nearly non-existent. There's some major cities that haven't had a new case in over a week. So we're pretty much opened up at this point because we took it pretty serious at the outset.
So you're going to stay there, or you ever going to come back to the States?
I'm going to come back soon, actually. There's I hope a bit of follow-on work with the book that we're about to discuss that I'm excited to get to, and some other projects I'm working on as well. That'll be bringing me back pretty soon.
So let's talk about the book, Greyboy. That's an interesting title. Shall I presume that speaks to the gray area in which you have found yourself living your life? Yes,
that would be a safe presumption. The title Greyboy I actually borrowed. The language itself I actually borrowed from a poem that the quote is used as an epigraph before one of the chapters. It's an Amiru Baraka poem. I think it's called Poem to Half-White College Students. And in it, he is exceedingly critical of the kids that I attempt to discuss and present in the book. Black kids who are sort of, in his estimation, not black enough. And I think the quote goes something like, "Are you sure you're not an imitation Greyboy? Are you sure you are not so full of Richard Burton that Elizabeth Taylor is coming out of your ears?" And he's critical of that population. So I kind of liked once I was batting around several titles for a long time, but once I read that poem, I really liked the idea of borrowing that language. So for a long time it was called Imitation Greyboy, and then I ended up just going with Greyboy.
So that was one presumption, but then the other one I thought it might have been because you're a Hoya. Gray. Is that? But that didn't have anything to do with it, right?
It is. That has nothing to do with it, but I am a proud Hoya. and this book was born in the hallways of Georgetown University.
So I want to get to college, but first let's start. You were raised in Philadelphia. Do I have that right?
Yes, I was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Spent probably the first 4 or 5 years of my life there. Went back regularly thereafter. But called Philly home for just about all of my life until I went to college.
So when was finding your blackness? How early in life did that become an issue?
I think that those racial lines are things that kids begin to negotiate pretty early in life. And I think research even shows that as well. We develop a consciousness of race pretty early in life. So for me, I think my earliest sort of racialized memories are probably third grade, second grade. And at that point, I think that they're sort of innocuous, not they lack kind of the frustration that comes later in life, comes in middle school with sort of more aggressive racial confrontations.
You went to white schools as you were growing up in Philadelphia, correct?
Yeah. I went to private school basically from the time I got to Philly until I graduated.
And so you're saying that you exposed those racial lines even as a child.
Well, I think there's a certain you begin to understand that my being black, my being the only black person in most of the rooms that I would enter and exist in, you begin to understand early on that there is some difference to negotiate there. I think that comes in part from your parents. I mean, my parents told me in no uncertain terms, I am not your white friend's parents. And what does that mean at age, 8, 9 years old? Trying to understand that they're clearly calling upon some knowledge that I don't have yet. And then once you get to middle school, particularly, I think as boys and girls start to look at each other differently, I think then it becomes a bit more difficult. Then there's just a more of a bite to it. There's more animosity to it, I think. Then you begin to confront racism as such rather than just difference.
You mentioned the Baraka poem and college white students. What was your experience like at Georgetown? You were there many years after I was there.
Yes.
With all of my radical behavior, I didn't care how white it was. I acted super black, which got me into a lot of trouble, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yes.
What was your experience like at Georgetown in terms of negotiating in a white world and finding your blackness? Hold, I'm jumping ahead. Your parents. So are your parents multiracial or just what? Are they black?
No. My mother is Ethiopian. So I spent time going to Ethiopia, to visit grandma and grandpa when I was younger. And my dad is Black American from the Midwest, so I spent a lot of time in West Virginia and Indiana growing up as well.
Because we frequently have these types of conversations with individuals of mixed race parentage.
Yeah.
But I mean, as far as I'm concerned, both your parents are black, one African, one African American.
Yeah.
So I guess then, even with your parents being both people of the Black and African diaspora, the fact that you went to some of these white schools was where you still had to negotiate your blackness.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, like unequivocally, we are black and I am black. Both of my parents. I mean, my mom, even though being from Ethiopia, was raised largely here in the U.S. Both of them are African American and proudly so. So this was the in-betweenness, the grayness that I'm attempting to sort of dissect and negotiate in the book is not at all one of a biracial lineage. It's more, my parents, both of them worked their butts off and were able to afford us a much better life than they were given. And as a result, they placed us in this environment that was almost exclusively white. And there were clear advantages to that. I mean, the fact that I'm calling you from Sydney, Australia speaks to one of those advantages. I'm not blind to those facts. But there were also some, I think, unintended consequences to being surrounded by dissimilarity, being surrounded by people that do not look like me and have certain preconceived notions of what I should be, not what I am. So that's what I attempt to wrestle with in the book, is this negotiating sort of not a biracial in betweenness, but feeling in between because I am black and yet this environment does not recognize me as I am.
So tell us about Georgetown then. What were your experiences like there?
I had a really positive experience at Georgetown. I think that Georgetown, I certainly understand what you mean. I mean, Georgetown had, like many PWIs, predominantly white institutions, colleges have, almost like a subculture that was black. Like it was almost like there was the mainstream Georgetown, and then there was Black Georgetown, which was like its own, like sovereign nation. Kind of how I speak about the Black Table and my experience with that in high school. It was almost like that. I think that my experience growing up in places like Georgetown, though, allowed me, frankly, to cross, cultural lines in ways that maybe others wouldn't have been able to. And I liked that. I liked that Georgetown. My experience in Philly was one of largely rich white people, black people, working class. I mean, like it was like there was only there's a finite number of archetypes that existed in Philly. It felt like it wasn't as diverse gets. In Georgetown, I had friends from all over the world. And was able to learn from their experiences and cross cultural lines in a way that I think my experience endowed me that ability.
Philly, how did you feel
Yes.
about the fact that Philly came through and helped elect the first African American woman vice president?
There's only one way to feel. I mean, like I have never felt as much FOMO as I've never felt such a longing to be back home as I did a couple days ago, seeing the celebrations in the streets in Philly. I'm so proud of the work that was done there. I'm not surprised by it whatsoever, but I am absolutely proud of it.
What are your thoughts about the state of race relations and all of us finding blackness, having just survived this Trump era, or barely? There's racism in the pandemic. We're dying disproportionately. Yeah. There's been the reckoning. Yeah. There's been Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. The list goes on and on. Jacob Blake. How do you feel? And seeing, as I said earlier, how many millions of people who voted for this racist in the White House?
Yeah.
What are your feelings about that as you have been trying to find your blackness? What about the state of blackness for all of us? What do you think about it?
There's a chapter in the book that was written entirely the week after Donald Trump was elected in 2016. In many ways, it was cathartic for me to process through many of those emotions in the wake of that election. And, what I say in that chapter and how I felt in that moment was that I don't know how much hatred Donald Trump inspired, but he certainly unmasked a lot that was pre-existing. He gave voice to just clear racial anxieties that exist for a much broader swath of the American populace than I think many of us knew in 2020. I think that effect, that unmasking effect, that revealing of racism, continued on throughout his 4 years, and we continued to see just how deeply ingrained those racial anxieties, that racism is in the fabric of America. I mean, like it is a part of America, and so much of our history, and so for those reasons, I think that now that we have seen the depths of that hatred, and now that we've seen that despite an abject failure of 4 years, he's still able to garner whatever he'll end up with, 48% or something of the American vote. I'm left not wholly optimistic in this moment, despite the fact that I'm super encouraged by the election of Biden, of course, obviously with Kamala by his side. I look at what we've all collectively gone through these last 4 years, and I think to myself that it's going to take a lot of time to heal these scars. I'm also aware that Trump, just because he has been voted out of office, is not going to ride off into the sunset. I think that Trumpism and Trump as the figurehead of Trumpism will exist for many years into the future, and I am concerned about the damage that he can continue to bring upon our system when he's not unencumbered by a bureaucracy that would hold him back. So I'm concerned. In summation, I am deeply concerned.
Where were you on the path to finding your blackness in a white world when Trump was elected?
I think if you had asked me in that moment, I probably would have told you that I was pretty far down that path. I probably would have told you that I had completed that journey. In fact, this book I started when I was a junior at Georgetown, I just released this past September. So it took me 4 full years to complete. And I think in some ways it was actually like, the book is about the journey, but the book also inspired the journey. The book charts the journey in real time as well. And the Trump chapter does not come at the end of that journey. There's still been a few key events. I mean, there's been key moments during his presidency where, again, we just saw like how ugly things can get. And that was still shocking to me, even at age 22, when I considered myself a skeptic. So I was far along, but not quite all the way there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I can only imagine all of us thought we were a little bit further along, because after all, we did have first black president. That happened.
Yeah.
And black folk didn't elect him on our own. That's what's been jarring to me. I mean, historically not jarring, because it's the same thing that happened right after Reconstruction. The white lash, sharp white lash back in the just unfettered racism. But this ain't Reconstruction. It's in 1860s.
Yeah.
So, I think your point is well taken. Even with all the skepticism we're bound to have as black folk, this thing just took us for a loop.
Right. Yeah, and I think that going into, I think many of us really learned that lesson. I think that going into election 2020, you heard from people how reticent they were to even acknowledge the possibility of Biden winning. I mean, like you talked to people a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, and it's like, despite the fact that the polls, which we now know, of course, were not right, but despite the fact that the polls were saying that this was going to be, the blue tsunami, you talk to people and they're not even willing to acknowledge that as a possibility. They're saying, Trump's going to do it again. They're now doubling down and betting on racism in America. And frankly, even though Biden did win, I'm not sure that thesis was disproven. I mean, it was close enough that racism is still a safe bet. It was close enough that if you're betting on, a demagogue that will demean me and my kind, you're within the margin. And that's an ugly side of our country.
What would you say, Cole, to those who now want to find their own blackness in post-Trump, hopefully post-Trump, white America?
Right. Man, that's interesting. I think that, so there's a part of it that was not, there's a part of it that was out of my control. There are key events, and there's key events in any person's life that are out of their control, but, are formative. The Trump election was one, and the killing of Trayvon Martin was another. I think time will show me that the murder of George Floyd was another. There's these key events that spur change in one, right? But then I think there were some things that are self-starting, or at least had been handed down to me, that made a real difference as well. My parents forced me, and I write about this in the book, my parents forced me when young to read all sorts of stuff that no other 8-year-old was reading. Autobiography of Malcolm X, Black Boy, Native Son, Go Tell It on the Mountain, all of the canon of Black literature that tells our stories authentically that I was not shown in schooling. That was significant for me. That changed how I viewed myself and how I viewed my people. And in terms of things that are, that within one's control, I think educating, yourself about our own history is an important factor.
Yeah. And we all must do that. What's the atmosphere like in Sydney in terms of race relations and you being an African American in Sydney? What's that like?
Yeah. There's no Black people in Sydney, like point blank, like there's just not many Black people. In Sydney and Australia writ large, and in fact, even that term Black is used differently here. If you were to speak about a Black person in an Australian context, you're typically talking about an Indigenous person rather than an African or African American. So it's been a really interesting time to be here. There was a massive Black Lives Matter protest in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and I was out there. I'd never been around so many white people telling me my life mattered. It was just a whole lot of white people shouting about BLM. So there have been at times, deeply isolating moments, particularly in the wake of George Floyd. Not feeling as though I was, close enough to my community, sort of grappling with that. That said, Australia does have its own deeply problematic, troubling, abusive history with Indigenous and Aboriginal people here. And it's interesting because I'm in the media quite a bit here now and am often asked, my opinion on those issues. And I have to remind people that I just got here 8 months ago. And this is an issue that is centuries long. And I think people often assume that I would have some insight into the plight of Indigenous people here because of my status as an African American. It's just simply not the case. So it has its own troubling history, is my point. Divorced from ours.
Yeah. So I asked you how far along you were. Lastly, where are you today? Where do you feel you are on this quest to find your Blackness in this white world?
I think I'm pretty good. I think I'm comfortable. I mean, what so much of the book is about being uncomfortable, is about being in these spaces, whether they be Black or white, and not feeling as though I fit snugly, because of the ways in which I differ from, whatever crowd I'm amongst. And I don't get that anymore. I mean, I think Georgetown took me a long way down that path, actually. I feel good about, I can do something like move to Sydney, Australia, and acknowledge the pros with the cons and leave here with a pretty fantastic experience. I feel that way about many of the spaces I enter at home, as well. All of those reflections should come with the caveat that there was a time when I would have said that before, and then Trump was elected. So I guess in some sense, who knows? But I do think I've come pretty long way on that journey, and like where I've landed. And the book charts that journey, both in myself and in others.
When are you coming back home?
I think first week of January, just before the inauguration. There's like one project I'm wrapping up here. It might even be a bit sooner.
Right. Okay. And what about your parents? Your parents still with you?
Yes. My mother lives here in Australia, actually. So it's been nice to spend time with her. We were in lockdown together, first time moving in with my mother as an adult, so that was an experience, but we got through it. My father is in the U.S.
Okay, very good. Well, my brother, congratulations on your book, folks. The book Greyboy, inspired by an Amiri Baraka poem, Finding Blackness in a White World. Fellow Hoya Saxa, Cole Brown has been my special guest. Cole, thanks for joining us on Make It Plain, and congratulations on the book, man. Great work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for getting woke and listening to Make It Plain. Please remember to listen, like, subscribe, and wherever you get your podcasts, please give the show a 5-star rating. And please do spread the word. Let's all continue to pray for each other during this pandemic and this police-demic. If all hearts and minds are clear, it has been made plain.